I painted this, and this is exactly how I did it. When I started this project, all I knew was that I wanted to paint a blank skateboard. When trying to come up with ideas, there are two ways I go about it. Choose the style first and let that influence the subject, or choose the subject first and let that influence the style. I knew I wanted to do something graphic, but I had no solid plan in mind. So I decided to doodle and find my subject first. That's how I settled on the raven, which led me to a high contrast black work style. I have the main subject decided, so now I need to figure out the full composition. That means it's time for thumbnails. I took a photo of my sketch and played with the composition on Procreate, doodling other elements and experimenting with ideas to find something I like. I decided pretty quickly that I wanted to do a half black and white background. Then it was just a matter of balancing the two halves together. This is the design that I settled on. Now that I know all the elements that I'm including in the painting, I can go back to drawing on paper to plan out the different subjects. Drawing the same thing again helps me become more familiar with the design, and it allows me to correct any mistakes in the initial doodle. Once these new sketches were done, I took another photo so I could do my line work digitally, which allows me to easily print off the design at the correct size, making it easier to transfer to the board. Before I can jump in and transfer my line art to the skateboard, I need to prepare it so it's ready to be painted. I did buy this from the art supply store, so I was hoping it was pre-prepped, but it felt pretty rough and I wanted a smooth surface for the paint to easily apply to. I sanded the board and I sprayed the wood to seal it. As I wanted to leave the wood tone as my light areas in the painting, I couldn't use my regular primer as that dries white. I figured out what size my artwork needed to be by measuring the board and then printing out a rough copy of the line work. From there, I created masks from removable vinyl to prevent any of the black paint getting on areas where I didn't want it. After carefully placing the vinyl on the board, I taped off the edges and the top half of the board so I could spray paint it black. 2 coats gave me a nice even coverage. Once that was dry, I removed the vinyl and success! There was no bleed underneath and it came out quite clean. Now to finally transfer my line art to the skateboard. I used a classic trick to do this. After printing out my line work to the correct size, I flipped it over and used pencil to draw over the lines. Then I taped it to the skateboard with the printed side facing up. By using a pencil and applying pressure as I drew over the lines, it pushes the graphite from the back of the paper onto the board. Normally a pen would work better for this, but I didn't want to risk indenting the wood. I removed the paper, and after a few minor touch-ups, the sketch was on the skateboard. Time to move on to the exciting part. All of the previous prep has led to this. Instead of just using black and grey, I wanted to use blue tones. I still wanted a monochrome look though. I had a rough idea of how I wanted to approach this painting, but I decided to fill it out as I went rather than pre-planning exactly how I was going to do it. The main brush that I used was this lining brush. For my paint, I am using acrylic and mixing in some water to help thin it out. This helps me load more paint onto the brush and allows me to do longer lines without running out of paint. Since this is a large surface and quite a small brush, I did run out of paint quite a few times. To find the right balance when adding in the water, I add a little bit in at a time until I find the right consistency. I am looking for a smooth application while not adding too much water so the paint doesn't become transparent. To load up my brush, I swipe it through the paint while twisting, and then lightly swipe it onto the palette or a piece of paper towel to remove any build-up from the tip of the brush. If you want to paint in a similar style to this, do not do what I did. Do not. It is not optimal. As I was figuring out as I went, I obviously didn't know the best way to approach the painting. If I were to paint it again, I would start off with all my light tones and then layer on light from dark. Honestly, I didn't realise I would be mixing a lighter colour as I had planned to leave the wood open for those lighter areas. I added the lighter tones because I felt like it needed something more, and then left the areas closest to the light source free from paint. As I added more tones and layers, I had to repaint areas that I had already done to neaten them up and to add my new tones. I had to do that many times. Moving down to the eye, I kept it simple and bold. Remember how I sanded the board before painting? Well, this section felt smooth before I started, but loose pieces of wood kept appearing as I painted. I think it's because it's on the curve of the board, so I didn't really have this issue anywhere else. And I did sand the ends quite a bit as they felt rougher to begin with. Even with all of the repainting and cleaning up, it didn't take as long as I expected it to. In my original line work plan, I was going to line pretty much all of the feathers, but I liked the definition that the layering of the tones was creating, so I decided to leave it as it was. Speaking of lines, let's get to adding them. When lining, go from point to point to get a nice smooth clean line. I'm using the corners where the feathers meet as my points. As some of these lines are pretty long with no good places to stop and start, if I needed to stop to reload my brush, I would try my best to line up with the previous stroke. Take it slow and steady. no rushing allowed. It's very close to the end now. The last thing left to do is add the whites to the brightest points of the painting. A little in the eye, a little on the side of the raven. I didn't want to overdo my whites, I just wanted to give a bit of a boost to those brightest areas. I debated leaving the text blank to let the wood tone come through, but at the end of the day I decided to paint it white. Much like the lines, I go from point to point, taking my time. I use a larger round brush to fill in the centers of the letters. For the text, I was thinking of phrases such as one eye open or an eye for an eye, but I didn't want too many words or letters. By simply having one eye, they lined up nicely as they are the same length, and I could have it quite large on the board. If I was designing this for a usable skateboard, I wouldn't put the text there as the font will just be covered by the trucks. But as it's an art piece, I like the composition, so I left it in that position. Sorry, but no writing allowed. I said the white was the last thing. I lied. But I also forgot about the swoopy black lines that I had included in my concept art. As these lines are quite long, I couldn't do them in one smooth motion, so I tried my best to smooth them out as they went. All that is left now is to remove the tape from the edge of the board. This is the final painting. It still needs to be sealed, but I'm still figuring out what to use to give it a nice glossy finish. I am considering giving it a thin layer of resin for that high shine and protection, but I don't really have the space to accommodate that, so I might need a compromise. What a journey it was to finally paint this board. I am quite happy with the outcome, and I think I'm going to use a similar style the next time I decide to do a large painting. Yippee! 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 It's done.
Whoop!